Hello and welcome back everyone. In today's episode, we talk about housing in Singapore. But of course, no conversation about housing can be complete without mentioning the man who lives in the single biggest private home in Singapore, the Raja of Ridout Road, Coordinating Minister for National Security and Minister for Home Affairs K. Shanmugam, seen here, suddenly realizing that POFMA also applies to his Tinder profile. To recap, Singapore is in the middle of a cost of living crisis and the price of homes has skyrocketed. But Shan is living in a massive colonial bungalow for a minuscule rent and somehow convinced the Singapore Land Authority to more than double the size of the property from 9,350 square meters to 23,164 square meters while barely increasing the rent. Look at the size of that land, it's 20 times as big as 38 Oxley Road. The Pinnacle at Duxton has approximately 8,000 residents on 2.5 hectares of land. 26 Ridout Road is almost the same size as the Pinnacle, but only has Shanmugam and whatever he's been building with his massive renovations and earthworks in Ridout Road. I've publicly said it's a sex dungeon and he didn't POFMA me, so it must be true. In fact, the only thing bigger than that property in Singapore is Shanmugam's ego. And Shan is only paying 11 cents per square foot per month on the entire land area. The highest median rent for an HDB we could find was for a 5-room HDB flat in Queenstown for 4,400 Sing dollars per month, or around $3.50 per square foot. Keep in mind that's median rent, not even highest rent. Likewise, comparable good-class bungalows also go for $3 to $4 per square foot per month on the entire land area. Shan is paying 11 cents. Now, naturally, haters asked whether there was any abuse of power. Of course not. And Shan was very clear on this.
There was lots of lurid allegations about my benefiting financially, taking advantage of the state, allegations of conflict of interest, even lawyers jumping in, totally untrue articles, even by lawyers. And there is no conflict of interest. No conflict of interest, because there can only be a conflict of interest if I have an interest in the matter and I make a decision. If I am not making a decision, I wasn't making a decision. I was not in the chain of command. I recused myself. Somebody else took over. So it's absolute balderdash. And any lawyer worth his salt will know that.
Yes, balderdash. The people at the Singapore Land Authority, which is a statutory board under the Ministry of Law, had no chance against the brilliance of Shanmugam, then the Minister of Law. If I had to negotiate with my boss's boss, I would not give him a good deal. No, I would fight my boss's boss all the way to make him pay as high a rent as possible, even at the risk of my own job. But Shan got a good deal, because he is a brilliant negotiator. He says the rent is market value. Of course it's market value. The Singapore government controls 90% of the land in Singapore, so it can dictate the market rate for any property, and Shan is part of the government. So whatever he says is market value is market value. And Shan has been cleared by the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, which is an agency under the Prime Minister's office, under then PM Lee Hsien Loong. His fellow minister and friend Teo Chee Hian also led a review of this issue and completely cleared Shan. Teo, of course, was totally impartial in reviewing and clearing his friend and fellow PAP cabinet minister. After all, Shan is a man of utmost integrity. He has never lied to us or misled us.
And we are just dealing with a very basic thing. Is something true? Something not true. Is the color of this table white or is it black? It's factual. We are not dealing with opinions here. Opinions people can have, but we are dealing with facts.
Now, Shan is of course notoriously litigious. He has sued and threatened and POFMA'd a lot of people, particularly anyone who has mentioned Ridout Road, including the Online Citizen and Bloomberg. And he and Vivian Balakrishnan were awarded more than 600,000 Singapore dollars when they sued Lee Hsien Yang over Lee's comments on Ridout Road. To be fair, to Shan, 600k is just a little slap on the wrist, since he made 80 million Sing dollars in profit from the sale of his family home at 6 Astrid Hill to the mysterious Jasmine Villa settlement.
Jasmine.
600,000 Singapore dollars is nothing to Shan. But to us at New Narrative, 600,000 Sing dollars is like 4 to 5 years of our entire operating budget. Shan, of course, loves going over everything I say with a fine-tooth comb. And if there's one thing we know about Shanmugam, he is very hands-on at work. Just ask the women who work under him. So I know he's going to watch this video himself, hi Shan, to go after us for any hint that he is engaging in wrongdoing. So before we get the inevitable threatening letter from his best bosom buddy, his brother from another mother, Devinder Singh, threatening to sue us, let me state again that Shan has done nothing wrong. No, he has done nothing wrong. Nothing! How dare you accuse him of any wrongdoing? And for the purposes of POFMA, let me say I'm not insinuating anything, nor am I making a series of speculative associations, nor am I implying the reverse of anything, nor psychically implanting ideas in people's minds, nor signaling in code or whatever the next stupid excuse POFMA is. Although, it is a fact that in 2020, the annual salary of Temasek CEO Ho Ching was more than 100 million Sing dollars a year. It is a fact that Singapore continues to engage in the arms trade with Israel. And it is a fact that Singaporean-made arms have been used by Israel against Palestinians in Gaza since the current conflict started in October 2023. On the contrary, I am here to defend Shan. Shame! Shame on you haters who say he abused his position. Shame! Did you know that despite the insanely low rent, Shan said he can't actually afford 26 Ridout Road on his current salary? Poor thing. Haters will point out that he's paid at least 1.7 million Sing dollars a year, so the rent is just 19% of his salary, so he should be able to afford it. And they say if he really can't afford it, then it's a moral hazard for the most powerful man in Singapore to be exposing himself to such financial risk. No, the most powerful man in Singapore. Yeah, that's better. So, they say it's a moral hazard for the most powerful man in Singapore to be exposing himself to such financial risk, especially when we know for a fact that there are rich people out there hanging about ministers, whispering in their ears, tempting them. But no, Shan is not susceptible to such temptations. I mean, we know Shan is morally upright and rigid. Very upright, very rigid. Shan has done nothing wrong. He's been totally open and honest and transparent. So what if his phone auto-deletes messages? As he said,
if questions are asked, you've got to be prepared to open up and say everything. That's all. That's the way Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has always dealt with things. And that's why Singapore is successful.
yes, and if Lee Kuan Yew was still alive and still in charge today, I'm sure he would have been really happy with Shan renting that house. Really happy. In fact, all of you should be ashamed for questioning Shan's integrity. I have a rude shock for all of you naysayers who just exist to oppose for the sake of opposing. We interviewed Shan's secretary, and it turns out that there is a really good reason why he needs such a big house. It's for his dogs. Yes, it turns out that Shan has a big family of at least 8 spaniels, and he needs the space because they don't get along, so they have to be separated by breed. So his secretary tells me he likes to keep his 2 Welsh Springer Spaniels on the second floor of the house. He likes 2 Water Spaniels on the ground floor. He likes 2 King Charles in the garden. And according to his secretary, he likes to cocker in the dungeon. This is the show with PJ Thum. Welcome back. This episode, we're talking about the challenges of Singapore's housing program, especially in the context of the skyrocketing price of housing in Singapore. Public housing might be the greatest achievement of Singapore's People's Action Party government. Around 85 to 90% of Singaporean households are housed in approximately 1.1 million Housing and Development Board, or HDB, public housing flats. Over the past 70 years, these flats have been generally affordable and help ensure that every Singaporean can have their own home. But there are three major challenges. First, the surging price of housing in recent years has priced young Singaporeans out of the system. But second, at the same time, the price of flats cannot come down because retiree savings are overwhelmingly tied up in those flats. Singaporeans are on paper wealthy, but only because the value of those flats have skyrocketed. We don't actually have much savings for retirement because we pre-use those savings to buy our flats. This situation is caused mainly by a fundamental contradiction. The PAP government wants socialised housing to be affordable for all Singaporeans, but also an investment that will increase in value so that Singaporeans are not reliant on state welfare. In practice, however, it cannot be both. And this situation is becoming increasingly urgent because the HDB flats were sold with 99-year leases and the value of those flats nosedived at 40 to 60 years old. Around half of the 1.1 million flats in Singapore are between 35 and 54 years old. When those leases run out, the flats return to the government and the occupiers get nothing. So it's a ticking time bomb that will begin to explode in the next 5 years. And that's it. That's all you need to know to understand the central contradiction facing housing in Singapore. I guess we can end early. For an in-depth study, please read the article at newnarrative.com, link here or in the show notes below. Okay, if you're still here, let's go through it step by step. What is public housing in Singapore? In Singapore, most people live in flats built by the government. These are called HDB flats. HDB stands for Housing and Development Board. About 8 out of every 10 families live in one of these flats. These are homes built using taxpayer dollars and sit on land that the government owns. The government says that when you get a flat, you become a home owner. But here's the catch. You don't actually own the flat. You're really just borrowing it for 99 years. This is called a lease. This is different from private property. In private property, a 99-year leasehold gives you full rights to a property for the term of the leasehold, 99 years. But you do not have full rights to your HDB flat. That means you don't truly own your home. You're like someone renting a seat at a Taylor Swift concert or a Champions League game. You get to enjoy it for a long time, but at the end of the show, you gotta leave. Normally, when you buy something like a car, it immediately starts falling in value. Everything depreciates: cars, phones, yogurt, New Year's resolutions. We know that at the end of 99 years, the value of HDB flats falls to zero because the lease ends and the government repossesses the flat. But in Singapore, the prices of HDB flats keep rising even as their inherent value keeps falling. And this weird phenomenon is at the crux of the whole issue around our flats. Why did the government build all these flats? A long time ago, under British colonialism, most people in Singapore lived either in kampongs or in slums. The slums were crowded, unhygienic, disgusting places. Not the kampongs, the slums. Big difference, which we'll get to. To solve the housing crisis in the slums, the British tried to build some nicer public housing like the old Singapore Improvement Trust flats at Tiong Bahru, which were actually beautiful, but they were too expensive, so no one bought them. After Singapore became independent, the government, led by the People's Action Party, wanted to fix this. They built thousands of new flats for people to live in, but they had one small problem. People don't want to live in flats. See, the half of Singapore who lived in slums, sure, they wanted to move. But the other half who lived in kampongs, they were happy. They had gardens, they had community, they had space. The new HDB flats were smaller, more expensive, far away from work or family, and really boring and alienating. In a kampong, you know all your neighbors. If you don't want to work, you can just grow chickens and vegetables. But Lee Kuan Yew didn't like that. He wanted people to have debt, like rent. This forces you to work, which means you can be exploited as a worker so that capitalists can make profits which the government can tax alongside your income so they have money to develop the country. So he started forcing people to leave their kampongs. Many people were forced to move. They got upset. In some areas, there were even riots because people didn't want to leave their homes. Today, we call those the 1964 race riots, but actually one fundamental motivating factor for people's anger was actually that they were being evicted from their kampongs. After all, there's a reason we talk nostalgically about kampongs and the kampong spirit. They were great places to live in, and about half of Singaporeans in 1960 lived in one. Imagine if you lived in a landed property today in Katong or Serangoon Gardens. Would you want to trade it in for an HDB flat? So the government had two major challenges: making people move and making flats affordable. How did the government make people move anyway when they didn't want to? In 1968, the PAP passed a new law called the Land Acquisition Act. This law gave the government the power to take land from people, even if they didn't want to sell it, and pay them less than the market price. By the 1980s, the government controlled 90% of all land in Singapore. This gave them the power to decide where people could live. The old kampongs were torn down and people were forced to move into HDB flats. The law itself is not inherently a problem. Land reform is one of the most important things a socialist government can do. The collectivization of Singapore's land in the hands of the people's representative is arguably the single most important policy the PAP government ever enacted. Leaving lands in the hands of private capitalists means they're very scarce resources monopolized by the rich for private wealth gain rather than used for the collective good. The problem in Singapore, however, is that our socialist government is also an authoritarian one, and when they abuse their power, we have no way of holding them accountable. And over time, our government has moved from socialism to neoliberal capitalism. The government itself, as I explained in episode 3 and 4, has become a capitalist, and they are now governing the country to primarily benefit private wealth rather than public good. And this has badly affected the public housing system. How did the PAP government make HDB flats more affordable? In 1960, around half of Singaporeans lived in slums in and around the city and they needed housing. From 1964, the government started building 3-room flats aimed at families. To pay for these, people could take out housing loans to be repaid monthly over the next 20 to 25 years. But they ran into the same problem that the British colonial government had faced. The flats were still too expensive. The turning point came in 1968 when the PAP allowed Singaporeans to pre-use their CPF savings to pay for flats. The CPF is, of course, compulsory savings, money taken from your salary every month to pay for retirement. This worked very well because the money was automatically taken out of your account. You never saw the money anyway, so people felt like they were almost getting something for nothing when they were able to pre-use that retirement money to pay for the HDB flats. The PAP government was also happy because they don't need to pay interest on your CPF if it's already been used to buy a flat. By the 1970s, most people were buying flats using CPF, using their retirement funds. But remember, people weren't buying the building or the land. They were buying the right to live there for 99 years. Why people think they own their flats, but they don't? The PAP wanted Singapore to be a nation of homeowners. They believed that if everyone owned their flat, they would care more about the country and be more loyal to it. So the PAP kept saying, and have kept saying, people own their flats. But actually, you just own a long lease. The PAP gets away with calling you an owner because legally you own the lease. Basically, you're the owner of a piece of paper that lets you stay in the flat. It's like renting a hotel room and the hotel manager gives you a key card and says that key card is yours to keep. So you are an owner. But you're not the owner of the room, you're the owner of the key card. But then, what's the difference in practical terms?
Look, you have your name on your HDB flat. After the MOP, of course, can you sell the flat? They all say, yes, we can sell the flat. Can you sublet a room or rent out the flat? And they say, yes, we can. So, does that mean you are a tenant? Can you do all that if you were simply a tenant? You can't. These are exclusive ownership rights.
So he's arguing it doesn't matter because you have all the rights of ownership. But again, you don't. Here are some of the things you can do with a private flat that you cannot do with an HDB flat. You cannot simply buy it or sell it or rent it out anytime you want. You cannot have as many pets as you want. You cannot run your company from your flat without a license. You cannot hang signs in the window. You cannot store combustible items. You cannot have guests overnight. You cannot make major renovations. You cannot mortgage your fully paid up flat. You cannot stop HDB representatives from entering your flat, and so on. But perhaps the easiest way for Singaporeans to understand this is you cannot en bloc your HDB. If you own a 99-year leasehold condo flat, you can do a collective sale, an en bloc in the Singapore parlance, to a developer. Even if there's only 1 year. Heck, even if there's only 1 day left in the lease, you can do it. But you cannot en bloc your HDB. So to go back to our metaphor, living in HDB is like checking into a hotel for 99 years, but only married people of specific races can check in. The manager says you're now a proud homeowner, then reminds you can't change the wallpaper, can't invite guests, his staff can enter your room anytime they want, and checkout is strictly enforced in 99 years or earlier if they want. But congratulations, you now own a keycard. How did HDB flats become more and more expensive? Well, by the late 1970s, the vast majority of Singapore's population was housed in HDB flats, and the government made a big change. They allowed people to sell their leases to other people and keep the profit. Before that, if you wanted to change flats, you had to sell your lease back to the HDB at the price they dictated. But opening up the resale market enabled people to sell to each other. This made flats more like an investment. The government even talked about flats as a way to help people save for retirement, saying, your flat is a nest egg. You could buy one, live in it for a few years, and then sell it at a higher price. This made many people rich, but it also made flats more expensive for everyone else. Why though? If you buy a car, its value drops the moment you drive it off the lot. If you buy anything, it loses value over time. The flats only have 99-year leases. Surely the value should steadily drop over time until it reaches zero? Well, capitalism. Remember, the free market does not measure what something is actually worth, it measures what people are willing to pay. It's like labubu. They cost pennies to manufacture, but are being sold for tens or hundreds of dollars. Why? Because people are willing to pay the price. At least with labubu, you get to keep the box forever. With HDB, you only keep the box 99 years. So until the 1990s, Singaporeans were getting richer and so could compete to pay more, especially for older estates with more amenities and better locations and bigger flats. And this situation has only gotten worse as Singapore has been stuffed with more new citizens and more foreign capital. So instead of the price of flats depreciating, going down in line with their actual value, their price has been going up, even though that is completely unrelated to what they are actually worth. And of course, there are a lot of problems with this state of affairs. Most obviously, if prices stop rising or drop, people may not have enough to retire. The HDB is a mess of contradictions. So here's the crux of the matter. The HDB system is trying to do two opposite things at once. It is trying to give people affordable housing, like a public good, and so it needs to keep prices affordable. But also let people sell flats for profit, like a private investment, to fund their retirement, and so it needs prices to rise. But this contradiction is only the tip of the iceberg. In previous episodes, I explained why the PAP government deliberately keeps wages low. It's to preserve capitalist profitability. One way it makes up for our wage suppression is through the HDB, by encouraging us to invest in our HDB flat.
Every Singaporean who owns a flat can double his value in today's terms within the next 15 to 20 years. In today's dollars.
But encouraging us to treat our HDB flat like an investment has huge problems and risks. One obvious problem is, of course, treating your flat like your piggy bank. When you need money, you have to break your piggy bank. But then, where do you live? Another is that Singaporeans' wealth and retirement plans depend on home prices rising forever. But if prices stop rising, or worse, if they fall, the whole system starts to collapse. But this system of wealth transfer is itself very problematic. See, first the government sells new HDB flats, the build-to-order flats, to Singaporeans at a discount, meaning below resale market price, and gives grants to first-time buyers. The discount and the grants are paid for by taxpayers. It's public money used to help buyers. Once people get their flats, they're allowed to sell them after a lock-in period of at least 5 years, sell them on the open market and keep the profit. This means the HDB is effectively transferring public money into private wealth, and in particular into the pockets of the upper class who have the capital and ability to buy and flip HDB flats. The more capital you have, the bigger the flat you can buy, the more you profit from this game. The rich get richer, but the poor have no way to get in on this game and instead are stuck with renting. It's like if the government subsidizes tickets to Taylor Swift or the Champions League, then lets you resell at scalper prices. Great if you were allowed to buy a subsidized ticket, but everyone else now has to pay scalper prices. Second, you may say, this is fine as long as prices keep going up. Singapore is land scarce and we keep adding more people, so prices will keep going up. But don't forget, HDB flats are sold at 99-year leases. People are putting more and more money into the flats, but the moment the clock hits 99 years, their value becomes zero and the government takes it back. Flats actually lose value dramatically after 40 to 60 years. Why? Because when you buy a flat, you usually take out a 20 to 30-year loan. So if you take out a 30-year loan on a 60-year-old flat, you're effectively paying all your retirement funds for an asset that is then taken back by the government just after you finish paying it off, leaving you with nothing. And half of Singapore's 1.1 million HDB flats right now are between 35 and 54 years old, which means the crisis is really going to start in 5 years. This situation has created a huge amount of moral hazard. So what has the PAP government done to try and solve this? Until around 2022, the HDB bought back flats at prices which were at prevailing market rates, under a scheme called the Selective En Bloc Redevelopment Scheme, which meant a big windfall for residents who had bought their flats at next to nothing 30 to 40 years ago. But this encouraged speculators to start buying up flats, hoping they could also benefit. Again, the rich get richer as prices rise. So instead, the government introduced a new scheme called the Voluntary Early Redevelopment Scheme, or VERS, but the exact details have yet to be announced, and experts are skeptical because ultimately it does nothing to address the central contradiction: affordable or investment? Asking people to think of the HDB flat as an investment for their retirement has, understandably, incentivized people to take risky bets on their own homes, encouraging speculation over stability. The PAP government are trying to have it both ways, and their chief policy has been to keep kicking the can down the road. In fact, they don't just kick the can, they boot it into Rosette like Micah Richards.
Richards went for power, he's gone too high.
But this is a very fragile system. It relies heavily on the government making the right decisions. If the government screws up, it can fall apart very fast. Just as it did back in the late 1970s when the PAP government first made a serious effort to address these contradictions. They made a series of very bad mistakes which led to the value of HDB flats falling underwater, in other words, below the value of their mortgage. And that contributed to angry Singaporeans electing these two people in the 1980s. This caused the PAP to panic and become afraid to really reform the system. Hence, the fear of major policy changes. But another consequence of the 1980s was the politicization of the HDB system, and this has created a lot of problems as well. The HDB system actively discriminates against minorities. One way the HDB was politicized was transferring the provision of public services from the HDB to the town councils as a way of punishing opposition wards. Another was the ethnic integration policy introduced in 1989, which tries to make the racial composition of every block and estate reflect the country as a whole. Its goal was ostensibly to encourage racial harmony, but actually it was to prevent minorities from forming voting blocks. It claims to prevent ethnic enclaves, but has actually turned the entire country into a Chinese enclave because under its bizarre logic, a block that is 87% Chinese is not an ethnic enclave, whereas a block with 26% Malays is an ethnic enclave. And of course, unmarried people cannot BTO and cannot buy a resale flat before 35, as if single people are some sort of disgusting lower class of human being. As we were filming this, National Development Minister Chee Hong Tat stated the government was considering eligibility changes for BTO flats. But tweaking the criteria does nothing to address the fact that having criteria means that anyone who doesn't qualify loses out big time. Ultimately, if the chief way we fund our retirement in Singapore is investing in our flats, then what happens to people who cannot afford flats, like the poor? What happens to people who are not allowed to buy flats, like unmarried people? What happens to people who cannot easily sell flats, like minorities? What happens to people whose flats are devalued because they live in an opposition ward? The HDB has become a huge mechanism for political control and social engineering by tying your financial survival in Singapore to being middle class, straight, married, Chinese, and a PAP voter. For the rest of us, the PAP's official advice is, have you considered your parents' sofa today? What? Your parents have no space? Your parents are abusive? Your parents don't like that you are gay? Well, have you considered going to fly a kite? What does this all mean for Singapore's future? Okay, so let me summarize. HDB is no longer affordable housing per se. Instead, it's very expensive upfront, but we tolerate this because of the implicit deal where we use public money to subsidize first-time buyers. Then, when the value of the flat rises, they reap the profits. It's a huge transfer of wealth to the middle class. For that reason, Professor Chua Bing Huat actually titled his book on the HDB, Public Subsidy, Private Accumulation. It's an excellent book. If you want to learn more about this central quandary, you should read it. But everyone who is not middle class, straight, married, Chinese, and a PAP voter gets screwed over. And there is a time bomb already ticking because the value of all flats falls to zero when their 19-year lease ends. So, what to do? Well, there are plenty of good solutions proposed by experts and by opposition political parties. But they are all different. And which one you prefer depends on your values and what kind of Singapore we want to have. In order to make that decision, I suggest we need to ask and answer 3 important questions. First, is public housing meant to be an affordable necessity, or is it meant to be a commodity and an investment opportunity? I've already explained all this. So, which one? Second, is our public housing collectively or individually owned? In other words, are HDB flats owned by all of us, built for the good of the country as a whole? Or HDB flats individually owned, in which case individual owners should be able to do whatever you want with them, even if it then makes things worse for everyone else? Third, is housing a privilege or a right? Remember, during the pandemic, when the government said everyone had to wear a mask, but they also recognized that there are very limited numbers of masks, and they didn't want hoarding or people to not be able to afford masks, right? So they gave all of us, every one of us, a free mask, and then ration and cost control further mask purchases. Remember that? Well, in Singapore, everyone has to have a home. It is illegal to be homeless. But there are very limited numbers of homes, and we don't want people to hoard homes or to not be able to afford homes, right? So shouldn't all of us, every one of us, get one affordable flat? And any further purchases of public housing be carefully rationed and cost controlled? Ultimately, Singapore, it comes down to what kind of society we want to build. Do we want a society where we take care of everyone regardless of their means, but accept that some people will then take advantage of that system? Or do we want a society where it's every man for themselves, where we prioritize money and where everyone who cannot afford to live here, well, too bad. Where do we make the trade-offs? That should be for us Singaporeans to decide. But if you ask me, our homes shouldn't be a piggy bank, a Taylor Swift concert ticket, or a Labubu. Homes should be homes. And on that note, don't forget to return your key cards when you check out. That's the show. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Hi everyone, if you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more of them, please visit newnarrative.com/support to join New Narrative as a member or donate to New Narrative. As a member, you gain access to our website with all our wonderful articles and comics and videos and podcasts, and you can interact with like-minded people who are fighting for a better Southeast Asia. So please do join as a member so we can keep making more of these videos. Thank you very much.